The room smelled of old paper and cold light. Velsorin loved it when it was like this. He had worked at the Safonto Classification Bureau for 31 years. And in 31 years, he had learned that one thinks best in rooms that don't try too hard. No windows, no decorations, only data, the hum of machines, and the quiet understanding that everything in the universe can be understood if you look at it long enough. He opened a file on his screen. Earth, the third planet from a yellow star. One moon, mostly water. The atmosphere is breathable, which was always the first thing he checked. Over his career, he had cataloged 62 species. 41 of them breathed something that could dissolve a human from the inside out. He appreciated the ones that didn't. He read the first survey data. His assistant, Mira Et, had collected them over the previous 6 months. She was young, having barely finished her training cycle, and she worked well, thoroughly, carefully. The kind of work that didn't need to be checked twice. He trusted her the way one trusts a tool that never breaks. The species was called human. He read the word again. Humans. It sounded strange, rounded, and a bit soft. Nothing in the sound hinted at danger. He liked that. The species he had catalogued with the most terrifying names turned out to be large, slow creatures that ate plants and were easily frightened. He started to read. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical. Average height from 1.5 to 1.9 meters. Life expectancy 70 to 90 years, which was short, almost aggressively short, like a candle compared to a star. They were warm-blooded, which, as the Quorum had discovered, meant emotional. All warm-blooded species were emotional. He suspected this had to do with how heat worked inside the body. He had no real proof. It was just his conviction. He continued to read. Humans had language. Many languages, in fact more than 6,000, which was not rare for a species that evolved in isolated populations across a large planet. They had art, music, painting, sculpture, things they created simply because they were beautiful, not because they were useful. That was always a good sign. Species that created useless and beautiful things, in Velsorin's experience, were the ones worth talking to. They had religion, dozens of religions, hundreds if you counted the minor ones. This too was not rare. They had war. He slowed his pace here. This was part of any planetary assessment that required caution. War was not automatically alarming. Almost every intelligent species went through a period of organized violence. Tribe against tribe, nation against nation. A messy early era of any civilization finding its borders. The Arats had gone through it. The Velkai had gone through it. Even the Laurenti, the founders of the Quorum, had a period in their history so violent that they simply didn't teach it in schools. War is a phase. That was the official position. And among the 62 cataloged species, the data confirmed it. You grow, you find better solutions, you stop. He noted the human wars in his report and moved on. The markers of civilizational development were good. They had nuclear energy. They had global communication networks. They had reached their own moon and left marks there that were still visible. They were not yet capable of interstellar travel, but they were moving in that direction, like a child stacking blocks. Not knowing the word architecture, Velsorin leaned back in his chair and wondered what kind of species this was. Emotional, creative, short-lived, and therefore likely in a hurry. The curious footprints on the moon spoke to this. You don't go to the moon if there isn't something in you that needs to know what is there. He liked curious species. They were the best. He started to write his assessment. The human species represents a mid-stage civilization, currently in the late conflict phase of its social evolution. Their aggression, apparently, is culturally conditioned and context-dependent, rather than biologically fixed. With sufficient external stability and positive diplomatic contacts, their intergroup violence is expected to self-correct within a few generations. They demonstrate strong markers of creative intelligence, social cohesion, and technological adaptability. Recommendation: first contact. Full offer of membership in the Quorum. He reread it. It was good, precise, clean. The kind of assessment that would pass through review without a single question. He sent it. Mira Et was at her desk in the small room adjacent to Velsorin's office. When the notification of the file submission arrived, she saw it and felt the familiar, slight tingling of a report she hadn't finished thinking about. She opened her copy of the Earth data. She didn't dispute Velsorin's conclusions. She wasn't the type to dispute her superior's findings, partly because she respected him, and partly because she wasn't yet experienced enough to believe that experience is almost always smarter than instinct. But in the biological review section, there was an item she kept returning to: the human shoulder joint. She had noted it when she first read the structural data. She had a degree in comparative xenobiology and had studied the musculoskeletal systems of 43 species, and she had never seen a shoulder joint like the human one. It had an extraordinary range of motion. It could rotate in ways unavailable to the joints of most species. The muscles around it were dense and arranged in a very specific configuration. She opened the kinetic analysis. The joint was optimized, and she used that word carefully, because optimization implies a purpose for one specific movement above all others: throwing. The human shoulder was, by a wide margin, the most efficient throwing mechanism she had ever seen in a bipedal species. It wasn't even close. The closest comparable species could throw a projectile at roughly half the speed with a quarter of the accuracy. She stared at it for a long time. Throwing in itself was not alarming. Many species threw things: food, building materials for nests, objects they needed to move from one place to another. It was a useful movement, but she was looking for context. What did humans throw? When? For how long? The archaeological data was old, very old. She went back 2 million years and found evidence not of casually dropped objects, but of purposeful, calculated throws, the kind of throws made when something is trying to run away from you or is approaching you with bad intentions. 2 million years. She wrote a short addendum to the data file. Not a challenge to Velsorin's report, just a flag. Note this alongside the shoulder joint analysis. Throwing data. She added a few minor notes on human pain tolerance and reflex speed that she had noticed in passing. She sent it to the general file, then went to have lunch and thought about other things. The Quorum Council Hall was the largest room on the station, which was the largest station in the known galaxy, which said something about how the Quorum thought of itself. Velsorin had performed in this room before. He wasn't nervous. 31 years of doing the job right had burned the nervousness out of him. He presented his findings on humanity. The council consisted of 7 species, 14 representatives. All of them were older than Velsorin. Most carried that particular kind of calm that comes from having seen everything twice. They listened. They asked questions, good questions, the kind that sounded simple but were not. How advanced are their space travel capabilities? Interstellar. Will they reach other systems within a generation? Maybe 2. Do they know about us? No confirmed evidence. Are they dangerous? Velsorin answered this as he always did. Every intelligent species possesses the potential for danger. It was almost the definition of intelligence. The question was whether that potential was expressed through violence or channeled into something else. Humans still directed part of it into violence, but their trajectory was positive. The council voted. A contact ship would be prepared and sent to the solar system within the quarter. Standard diplomatic package, peaceful broadcast, translation protocols, offers of dialogue. If humans responded well, the process of joining the Quorum could begin. If they responded poorly, that is, with aggression, the ship would retreat, and a longer period of observation would follow. No one expected aggression, really. Species capable of creating global communication networks are almost always capable of choosing conversation over conflict when someone offers them such an opportunity in a language they can understand. The meeting ended. Velsorin walked back to his office through corridors that hummed with the quiet business of an organization that had been right about almost everything for 400 years. He almost didn't notice the addendum to his report. Attached. Clears throat to your submitted report. He almost ignored it without reading it. It was a trifle. A note from his junior analyst. He had a dozen other assessments to start, but something made him open it. The words kinetic analysis of the shoulder joint, throwing optimization caught his eye in a way he couldn't quite understand. He read it. He read it again. The throwing data hit him in the chest in a strange way. He couldn't exactly say why. He wasn't a military man. He didn't think in terms of weapons and threat assessments. But something in the phrase 2 million years of throwing at prey made him stop in a way that wasn't intended to trigger the language of Mira. Et cautious, not alarming. He opened the full biological file. He read the sections he had skimmed. Pain tolerance. High. Significantly above average for warm-blooded bipedal species. The human nervous system is capable of filtering levels of physical pain that would cause most species to stop functioning. Not forever. They didn't feel no pain. They felt it. They just kept moving. Cortisol response. The human stress hormone system behaved in a way that was technically a defect in any other species. In extreme threats, the kind that would cause most organisms to stop, to freeze, or to collapse, the human cortisol system spiked and then rapidly cleared. What should have been overwhelming became fuel. They called it adrenaline in their literature. He read the word several times. It had no analog in the Vratan tongue. He closed the file. He opened it. He sat in his quiet room, smelling of old paper and cold light, and looked at the data for a long time. Then he opened a new document and began writing a secondary internal memo, marked as not urgent, personal research, not for submission. He wrote one line. Query: at what stage in evolutionary history did human aggression stop being a cultural product and become something more ancient? He saved it, went home. On Earth, the night before the Quorum contact ship crossed the solar system, a woman in a city called Nairobi sat at a desk and stared at radar data that made no sense. The object was too big for a satellite, too slow for a meteor, too perfectly aimed for either. She called her supervisor, and her supervisor called his supervisor. Within 4 hours, the information passed through 17 levels of government in 6 countries. By morning, the people who made a living making decisions found themselves in rooms with maps and screens, and with that particular quiet expression on their faces that appears in a person who already knows that the situation has no easy solution. None of them assumed the object was friendly. The Quorum sensors recorded the pattern of the human reaction. 17 separate governments, 6 hours. Military positions adjusted, communication protocols activated, defense systems quietly brought to high alert. The data was flagged by the Quorum analyst and sent to Velsorin's office. They lay in his inbox unread, automatically filed under immature civilization phase, expected. The translator was a program, and like most programs, it had opinions it didn't know it had. It was created by the Quorum linguists over 2 years. They had fed it every intercepted human communication they could gather. News broadcasts, radio signals, a long tangled network called the Internet, which contained more information than the Quorum analysts expected, as well as significantly more arguments about food than anyone could have prepared for. The program was very good at translating human words. It was not good at translating what human words meant. And so, when the Quorum diplomatic ship broadcast its message of peace to the human communication networks, a carefully crafted 12-point statement of goodwill, brotherhood, and hope for mutual understanding, what arrived in the government translation centers sounded, in several languages, not unlike a very polite ultimatum. The word that caused the problem was of Aret origin, vilanet. It meant, in the Aret language, something like, "We reach out our hands to you in hope." It was one of the warmest words in the Aret language. Poets used it. It appeared at wedding ceremonies. The program translated it as, "How we reach for you." In English, Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, and 4 others, "We reach for you." It sounded like what one says right before grabbing someone by the collar. 17 governments read the message. 15 of them switched to high defense mode without an order. It happened as naturally as breathing, without thought, without decision. Just the body doing what the body knows. The Quorum diplomatic team on the contact ship consisted of 6 people, led by Ambassador Taras Vel, who had 30 years of first contact experience and who had never missed an opportunity to establish peaceful dialogue within the first 72 hours. She was the best in her field. Her record was impeccable. She was about to meet the one variable for which her experience had no category. The human representative arrived at the ship 12 hours after the first contact. They sent a shuttle, which was impressive, because humans weren't expected to have anything capable of reaching the Quorum ship for at least another decade. The shuttle looked like it was assembled from parts of 3 different machines, held together by something that Taras Vel's engineers described as disturbing and then refused to elaborate. The human's name was Commander Danil Osei. He was a compact man of medium height, with a face that changed little, regardless of what was happening around him. He entered the Quorum ship the way a man enters a room he has already decided belongs to him. Taras Vel greeted him warmly. He reciprocated. The translator software, running in real time, handled the first 20 minutes of conversation satisfactorily. Greetings, names, the cautious, circular movements of a diplomatic meeting where both sides decide how honest to be. Then Commander Osei asked a question. "The message you broadcast, the word you used, villainette. What did you mean?" Taras Vel explained. She was precise and clear. She meant goodwill, hope, The opening of hands. Osei looked at her for a moment. And if we had said no? If we had told you we didn't want contact? Teresvel said, and she sincerely meant it as an honest answer, that the Quorum would have respected that decision and retreated to observe from afar until humanity was ready. Osei said, retreated to observe. Retreat to observe. Teresvel wasn't sure why he was repeating it. Osei leaned forward slightly. His voice remained the same. And in that time, did you see one shred of evidence that we wanted to be watched? Teresvel started to answer. She had a good answer, a reasonable answer about passive observation as a standard Quorum protocol for any pre-contact civilization intended for protection. Osei said, you watched us without our knowledge or consent for 6 years, then sent us a message that sounded like a threat, and now you want to offer us membership in your organization. It wasn't a question. I need you to help me understand why I shouldn't consider this an act of war, he said. Teresvel had never been asked that question in 30 years. She found she had no ready answer. The question had a shape for which her diplomatic training had left no room. She chose her best words. The translator software did what it always did, what she said. We had no intention of causing harm to your people. What arrived in Osei's earpiece was closer to, your people were not the goal. Negotiations failed within 4 hours. There were other failures, minor ones, stacking up on each other like small flaws until they turned into something large, a misread gesture, a silence that one side meant as respect and the other read as contempt. Osei wasn't an unreasonable man, and Teresvel wasn't a dishonest diplomat, but they were working with a broken tool between them, and neither of them knew it. Osei left. The shuttle returned. The Quorum ship waited. On the station, the news arrived to Fleet Commander David Aaron within an hour. Aaron was not a diplomat. He didn't pretend to understand diplomacy. What he understood was geometry. The geometry of fleets, combat ranges, how much force is required to reach a decision clearly and finally. He had 400 years in Quorum years that led to a situation that could not be solved by sufficient application of that geometry. He looked at the report on the failed negotiations. He looked at the data on the human military response. Heightened positions, activated defense systems, the way 17 governments instantly went to combat readiness within 6 hours of the first broadcast. He thought about the geometry. Remove the architecture of the threat before it matures, he told the council. First, a demonstration. Their moon is uninhabited. We will strike the surface and make it clear that any further aggression on their part, any further maneuvers, any defensive preparations, will be met with force they cannot overcome. The council approved. The calculation was clean. It had always worked before. The strike hit the lunar surface at 3:47 GMT. The explosion was visible from Earth with the naked eye. A flowering light on the dark side of the moon appeared, then disappeared, leaving a crater the size of a small city where there had been gray rock and old dust. Quorum sensors watched Earth. They expected panic, broadcasts, signals from panicked governments, the chaotic noise of a civilization that had just realized its place in the universe. They received 22 hours of silence. Not the silence of a species paralyzed by fear, not the silence of governments incapable of coordinating actions. The Quorum communication interceptors were working. They saw the traffic. Massive volumes, encrypted, purposeful 22 hours of a species talking very quickly and very quietly about something they didn't want anyone to hear. Arn was not concerned. This was normal. This was a species making calculations, arriving at the only reasonable conclusion, preparing for contact and negotiations from a position of acknowledged weakness. The silence would have to break. There would have to be a message, an offer of terms. He was ready to be reasonable. What broke the silence was not a message. It was a ship. The Quorum picket ships registered it first upon contact. Small, moving at a speed that shouldn't have been possible for human technology. Not faster than light, but close. Close enough that the Quorum engineers on duty looked at their instruments twice, and then at each other. The ship broke the picket line non-aggressively. It didn't fire. It didn't dodge. It just passed through, like something passes through a gap because the gap is there. It stopped in front of the diplomatic ship. It had no weapons. The scan was unequivocal in that regard. No weapons, no cargo other than minimal hull integrity, no crew of a size that could represent a military threat. There was one human on board. He asked, in the Arret tongue painful to listen to, but perfectly understandable to be taken to whoever was in charge. Teresvel, who hadn't slept for 20 hours, watched him come aboard on the security video. He walked through the airlock, just as Osei had walked through the diplomatic room, like a man who had already made a decision and was now just following it to the end. She noticed his hands. They were still. She had met many people under pressure in 30 years. Diplomats, military, heads of state. Under pressure, people move. They shift weight, check their hands, adjust their clothes, do the little physical things the body does when it's trying to deal with what's happening inside. This man's hands were still. She hid that somewhere in her mind, in a corner she wouldn't explore for several weeks. She went to meet him in her office. Velsorin was reading Mira Et's report on the shoulder joint again. He had read it 6 times in the last 3 days. Every time he put it down, he spent an hour thinking about it. He opened a new thread of research. He didn't tell anyone. This was officially personal reading in his free time, which wasn't rare for people in his field. Xenobiologists read constantly. Nobody would pay attention. He was reading human military history, not the modern history of war that he had noted and filed in his report. He was reading old history, very old history. Archaeological records of human conflicts before the first written word. Weapons appeared first. That was the part he kept coming back to. In the human archaeological record, weapons were always first, before sedentary farming, before permanent housing, before ceramics, before written language, before everything the Quorum used as markers of civilization development. Weapons were already there. He didn't know what to do with that. It didn't change his assessment. The early history of a species wasn't necessarily its destiny. The early history of the Arets was full of things they weren't proud of and had completely overcome. History is not destiny. But he kept reading. He was still reading when the alert came that one human ship had broken the Quorum picket line and was requesting direct contact with Quorum command. He stopped reading. He opened the live feed. He watched as the human boarded the diplomatic ship with still hands and eyes that had already made their decisions. Something shifted in Velsorin's chest. A nameless feeling, not fear. He wasn't a man who feared easily. Something more ancient than fear. The instinct a person gets when they look at something they haven't yet understood, but some part of them already recognizes. He opened Mira Et's report on the same screen. He read the line about the shoulder joint again. He looked at the human on the screen. He thought about throwing, about what they threw things at, about 2 million years of practice. Then Aron's response to the human's request came over the command channel. The answer was, no. The human will be returned to his ship. The strike on the moon was a demonstration. The next message from Earth must be a formal request for terms. Aron gave the order. On screen, Velsorin watched as the human received the news, watched his face, watched those still hands. Then the human's expression didn't change. He just nodded once, turned, and walked back to his ship. Velsorin watched him leave. Then he opened a new file. Request for emergency research funds. Investigation of human evolutionary history. Stress response and pre-verbal conflict behavior. He marked it as urgent. Approval came in 6 minutes. Routine. Unremarkable, the kind of thing that happened 20 times a day in a large research institution. No one paid any attention. Aron, meanwhile, was already drafting the invasion order. 4,000 ships against 40. He had the numbers before his eyes, like a man holding a winning hand, with the quiet, absolute confidence of someone who knows the outcome before the game ends. The math was clean. It had always worked before. The first 11 days of the war went exactly as the models predicted. This, in retrospect, was the most dangerous thing that happened. The Quorum fleet moved through the outer solar system with the precision that comes from 4 centuries of military practice. Formation tight, targeting clean. The communication protocols worked without a single error. They were a machine built, tested, and perfected over hundreds of years. And it showed. Every engagement ended in minutes. Human ships, small, fast, and heavily outnumbered, disintegrated under Quorum fire like things that had never been designed to survive a real battle. The numbers were coming in, and they were good numbers. 41 human ships destroyed. 11 Quorum ships damaged. Not a single one lost. The engagement reports read like training exercises, neat and final. The analysts who wrote them didn't sound concerned. They sounded like people sound when something they expected to be difficult turns out to be easy. On the 12th day, something changed. No one noticed it immediately. The change was small. A human tactical unit that was supposed to attack from the front instead came from below the ecliptic. a vector that made no strategic sense by common doctrine, except that the Quorum sensor array had a small blind spot at that angle, which the humans shouldn't have known about. The attack wasn't effective, the human ships were still outnumbered, and the exchange was still not in their favor. But they came from a blind spot. The analyst who wrote the report noted it as a possible coincidence and moved to the next engagement. On the 19th day, the Quorum lost its first ship. It happened at the edge of Mars's gravity well. A small human squadron, 6 ships, executed a maneuver that wasn't included in the engagement model because the model calculated it as statistically suicidal. The lead human ship took 2 full direct hits and kept moving. Kept moving! It should have fallen apart. The materials it was built from should have yielded to that energy transfer. They didn't. The human ship aimed straight for the center of the formation. It released something what analysts later debated whether it was a weapon or a part of the ship that had already detached, and 2 Quorum ships simultaneously lost propulsion. The other 5 human ships tore them apart. 1 Quorum ship destroyed, 1 disabled and abandoned. 6 human ships, all destroyed in the subsequent response. The numbers still clearly favored the Quorum. 1 ship against 2 wasn't a crisis, but the human ship had kept moving after taking 2 direct hits. The engineers filed a report on the human hull construction and were told it would be reviewed when resources allowed. Fleet Commander Aaron read the summary for the 19th day over his morning meal, and for the first time, he felt something he didn't recognize. He had commanded military operations for 23 years. He had led campaigns against species that were larger, faster, and had technologies the Quorum had never seen before. He had always acted based on a confidence that wasn't arrogance. It was just a product of the numbers being on his side. The numbers were still on his side. He knew that. He held the spreadsheet in front of him like a talisman. Quorum ships, 3,961. Human ships, 41 minus losses. There was no question about the ratio. What he didn't recognize wasn't fear of the ratio. It was the feeling of watching someone learn. He had seen species fight before. Most species, when disadvantaged, did one of 3 things. They kept fighting the same way until their ships were gone. They surrendered, or they fled. These were the 3 options that the models contained. These were the 3 options that the military history of 200 species had generated. Humans did none of these. They watched what worked against them, and then they stopped doing it. Every engagement generated new behavior. The tactics on the 19th day were not the tactics from the first day. The tactics on the 25th day would not be the tactics from the 19th day. They didn't repeat. In 23 years of military command, Aaron hadn't met a species that could rewrite its own field doctrine in the middle of a war, in real time, from a position of overwhelming disadvantage. He requested additional fleet assets, another 300 ships approved within a few hours. The math was still clean. He kept repeating it to himself. Velsorin hadn't slept properly for 11 days. It wasn't the war. The war was happening in space, far away, and Velsorin. It was happening around him, the way weather happens. Present, significant, but not something directly in front of his face. What was directly in front of his face was data. Mira-Et had been officially transferred to the research project. She came in every morning with new sections of human evolutionary history. Processed, organized, she was precise and efficient, and she had begun to develop that specific expression of a person who is beginning to realize something they weren't looking for. She had the expression of a person opening doors, discovering that the room behind them was much larger than the house looked. Velsorin knew that expression. He had been wearing it for 2 weeks. One morning, he called her into his office and turned the analysis on the main screen. "Tell me what you see," he said. She looked at it. She had already seen it. She had compiled most of it herself, but she looked at it again, the way one looks at something when one needs to say it out loud. "Predator record," she said. "Earth, all the large predators humans competed with. Larger, faster, better armed by nature. By a significant margin," Velsorin said. "By a significant margin." She agreed. Megafauna. Large animals they hunted. Some of them had hides that most human tools couldn't penetrate. Speed that a human couldn't match at short distances. The kind of animals that, by any reasonable assessment, should have quickly torn something the size of a human apart and moved on. And yet, the megafauna disappeared. Many of them disappeared directly after the expansion of human settlements into their ranges. A model repeated on every continent. The same story told by bones and extinction dates. Humans arrived. and the large animals died. Not because humans were stronger, not because they were faster, but because of something the data kept hinting at. And Velsorin didn't know the right word. Persistence, said Mira-Et. Persistence, he agreed. It was a weak word for what the data described. The human method of hunting, the one they used for 2 million years before they developed agriculture, was persistence hunting. You found an animal. You followed it. You followed it to the point where the animal was tired. You followed it to the point where any reasonable being would have stopped following. You followed it until the animal's body gave out from exhaustion, and you calmly approached it and finished the job. Not speed, not strength, not better weapons stamina. They were built to outlast, Velsorin said. He had said it before. He kept saying it because it was always the conclusion the data led to, no matter which side he approached it from. Mira-Et opened the psychological file. Stress response data. She had studied human medical literature, their own literature, the findings of their own scientists about their own species, and found something that made her sit very quietly for a very long time when she first read it. Cortisol clearance rate, she said. He nodded. He had read it. For most species, a sustained existential threat leads to an accumulation of stress hormones that piles up over time. The longer the threat continues, the less functional the organism becomes. It is a physiological limit. Eventually, the body cannot maintain combat effectiveness under constant pressure. For humans, there is no ceiling, Velsorin said. There is no ceiling, she said. Under a sustained existential threat, the human stress response spikes, and then it doesn't just stabilize, it produces secondary hormonal reactions that increase pain suppression, increase muscle efficiency, increase problem-solving ability. The more in danger they are, the more capable they become. The room was quiet. That is not a feature, said Mira-Et. That is not just something that happens. That is a body created for optimal functioning in the worst possible conditions. This is millions of years of selection for one specific result. Quote, survival in conditions of extreme violence, said Velsorin. She nodded. They both stared at the screen. Velsorin's personal notes were open in a separate window. He had written one line 3 days ago that he couldn't walk away from. What do you call a species that becomes stronger when it is wounded? He hadn't answered his own question yet. He wasn't sure the answer was a word he wanted to say out loud. He called Mira-Et in the evening, though he rarely called her after business hours. She answered. She sounded like she hadn't slept either. He told her he was reading the pain tolerance data again. She said she knew. She was reading it too. He said, the tolerance is not only physical, not only that they can endure physical damage without stopping. The psychological literature, their own psychologists writing about their own species, describe something they call post-traumatic adaptation. A documented tendency for humans who survive extreme violence to rebuild their priorities, relationships, their sense of purpose, to come out of the experience unbroken, functional sometimes, in their own words, more functional than before. Mira-Et was silent for a moment. We called their war a phase, she said. Yes, something they haven't grown out of. Yes. Another silence. How long have they been at war? Historically. Full report. Velsorin looked at his notes. He had written down a number, then put the paper face down on his desk and left it there. He picked it up now. He told her the number. She made a sound, not a word, just a sound, small and involuntary, the kind a person makes when a number is so large it stops feeling like a number. That's before language, she said. Before cities. Before anything we would classify as a civilization. Yes, they were at war before they had words for what they were doing. Before they had words for anything, Velsorin said. Weapons are the oldest artifacts in the human archaeological record. Not farming tools, not housing, weapons. Mira-Et said. I need to tell you something I found today. I was going to wait until morning, but I think you should hear it now. He waited. Data on social cohesion. Psychological studies of human groups under sustained threat. Any other species we've cataloged? Prolonged conflict destroys social bonds. Prolonged violence fragments groups, reduces cooperation, leads to the collapse of those social structures that existed before the conflict. For humans, she paused, started again. For humans, a sustained collective threat does the opposite. It produces stronger cohesion, greater cooperation, greater social unity. They have a term for it. They call it, she stumbled on the translation, brotherhood. Velsorin said, camaraderie. They have many words for it. They create new ones during every conflict. War doesn't break them. Mira said. It holds them together. The line was quiet for a long time. Velsorin, she said, I think we need to submit an official report. Not an addendum, not a personal research flag. An official emergency submission to the council. He was already opening the submission form on his screen. Subject, he said. What should be written? Mira pondered. We made a fundamental error in classification, she said. He typed it, sent it. Outside the window, the station moved silently in space. And somewhere in the direction of the yellow star, the war continued to produce its daily numbers. The numbers still favored the Quorum, but 22 days into the conflict, the human combat doctrine had changed 6 times. No other species in the history of the Quorum had changed doctrine once during an active conflict. Velsorin turned off his screen, sat in the dark, thinking about something. Following prey past the point where any reasonable creature would have stopped. Thinking about what that makes the prey feel. Thinking about the fact that humanity was the one who had been following for 2 million years. He didn't sleep well that night. He suspected he wouldn't sleep well for a long time. The council hall had a specific smell when things went badly. Not a bad smell, exactly. Just the smell of recirculated air that too many anxious people had breathed in and out for too many hours. Velsorin noticed it as soon as he entered. He had never noticed it in all his years of speaking in this room. He took it as a sign that things were indeed going badly. 14 council members sat in their seats. This was remarkable. Emergency meetings sometimes took place with missing representatives or those attending remotely. Everyone was present in person. This meant that someone, somewhere in the hierarchy above Velsorin, had decided this conversation needed to happen in one room. Arn was there too, in the far corner, arms crossed, staring at the wall of data with the expression of a man who had been reading bad news for 3 days and had come to see if it would get worse. It would get worse, Velsorin began. He didn't start with conclusions. In 31 years, he had learned that conclusions without foundations are just opinion. And in a room full of people who already had their own opinions bred arguments, he started with data. First, the oldest data. Weapons. He placed the image on the wall. Stone tools, 2 million years old, found at a site in what humans call Tanzania. He explained what they were. Not farming tools, not construction tools, not anything serving the purpose of housing or sustenance. They were designed to be held in one hand and used against something that was trying to run away or approach. The room was quiet, he continued. He showed the data on megafauna. He walked them through the model of human expansion across continents, the disappearance of large animals and the fossils in a timeline that matched the expansion almost perfectly. He tried not to comment. He just showed the dates and the model and let those two things sit together on the screen. Then, he showed the hunting method, persistence hunting, biological profile, shoulder joint, pain tolerance, cortisol response. He had visual aids. He laid them out specifically to build the picture in pieces, so the conclusion would arise naturally so the council would feel as if they were coming to it themselves, rather than being told where to go. One of the council members, Representative Kali Voon of the Velkai, who had never interrupted a briefing in 40 years of service, interrupted. Are you saying they were created for this? I am saying they evolved for this, Velsorin said, which, in the context of biology, is the same thing. She leaned back. He continued. He spoke about the psychological data, stress response, cohesion under threat. He had charts for this. Not because the charts were necessary for understanding, but because in rooms like this, charts made things solid, real something to point to, rather than just describe. The charts showed a species that became more dangerous under pressure. Not because they were reckless, but because they were created for it, just as a deep-sea creature is created for pressure. Not choosing adaptation to the environment, but being formed for millions of years until the environment became what they were created for. Quote, survival in conditions of extreme violence, Velsorin said. She nodded. They both stared at the screen. He left the data on social cohesion for the last moment because that was the part that wouldn't let him sleep. He explained it carefully. The destructive impact of prolonged conflict on every other species they had catalogued. The reverse human reaction. The fact that human groups under existential threat don't break, they harden. Then he told them something that wasn't in the official submission, a personal observation, something he had noticed in the human historical record while reading 3 days ago. Every major human war in their recorded history generated music. Not just art, but music specifically. songs written by soldiers in the middle of conflict, passed on and sung collectively, representing some need in the human organism to bind itself to the people around through sound. The pattern appeared in every culture, every era, every major conflict in human history, specific to the human experience in a way no other species has shown. They created music to stay together while they fought. He paused to let that settle. Arn, from his corner, said, "All this is very interesting. None of this changes the fleet numbers." Velsorin looked at him. "No," he said, "it doesn't, but the fleet numbers have changed." He switched the display. The new numbers were bad, not catastrophically bad. The ratio still favored the Quorum, but the shape of the numbers was wrong in a way that the ratio itself didn't reflect. After 30 days of conflict, the Quorum has committed 1,200 ships. We have lost 71, damaged another 104. The human fleet started with 40 vessels. They have lost 37. Arn started to say something. Velsorin pulled up the next slide. The human fleet currently has 412 vessels. The room went quiet again. "They built them," said one of the council members, not a question, just a person trying to confirm what he was seeing was real. "During active conflict," Velsorin said. "During the conducting of current engagements, absorbing losses, and rewriting combat doctrine. While they were doing all of this, they were building new vessels at a speed that analysts initially deemed impossible and have since revised 4 times. Current projections suggest," he pulled up a third slide, "that within 60 days, assuming current production rates, their fleet will number somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 ships." Nobody said anything. Velsorin let the silence do its work. "Doctrine change," said the council member finally. "They changed tactics 6 times in 30 days. 7 times now," said Velsorin. "As of yesterday morning, no species changes doctrine during an active engagement. The cognitive load alone." "They don't view it as doctrine change," said Mira-Et. She was standing slightly behind Velsorin to his right. She wasn't expected to be heard, but she spoke. "Their military structure doesn't work like ours. It isn't as vertical. Individual unit commanders have significant autonomy. When something stops working, the units that are still alive stop doing it and try something else. And then they report what worked to every other unit. Changes aren't ordered from the top. They emerge from the people who are actually participating in the engagements. Learning happens everywhere simultaneously." Another pause. "That is not a military structure," said one of the council members. "It is." He didn't finish. Velsorin finished for him. "It is more like an organism. Individual cells, units. Soldiers react to the environment. The reaction spreads. The whole adapts." And he paused. "We fought as if we were facing an army. We might be fighting something closer to an immune system." Arn, in his corner, was very quiet. Velsorin turned to the main question the council had, the one they had been driving toward since the start of the briefing. "The question that you are all holding," he said, "is whether this is a phase, whether the human capacity for war is something they grow out of, as the assessment suggested, whether with sufficient external stability it self-corrects." He looked at his notes. He looked up. "No," he said. One of the council members said, "How sure are you of this assessment?" "Completely," said Velsorin. "The initial assessment stated that aggression is culturally produced. The data does not support that. Aggression is biologically embedded to a depth that culture does not reach. Culture channels it, shapes its direction, provides context, but the capacity itself is not cultural. It is structural. It is in the bones, the muscles, the hormones, and the psychological architecture. This is not a phase. It is the future." Representative Kali Voon said, "Then what are we dealing with? A species that evolved for war against the megafauna of its home planet. That was the initial pressure. The megafauna disappeared. The large predators disappeared. The context that formed them no longer exists. So what do they do with that capacity now?" Velsorin said, "They use it against each other. They always have, but they also build, expand. They directed the same capacity into technology, into research, into construction on a scale the history of their planet has never seen before. They are not just a martial species. They are," he stopped, found the right words, "they are a species of force. Whatever they decide to do, they do it with everything they possess until it is done. War, science, construction. Music? They have no register for half measures. It is not in their architecture." There was a long silence in the hall. Arn spoke. His voice was level, but there was something else in it. Not fear. Arn wasn't a man who feared, something adjacent to fear, for which there was no name yet. "The fleet numbers," he said. 400 ships now, 1,200 projected. If we apply sufficient additional force, they will change doctrine again. Mira-Et said, "They will lose ships, they will learn from the losses, they will build more, you can break the human fleet, and they will learn specifically how you broke it, and they will not let you break the next one. Also, we will apply overwhelming force, sufficient so that there isn't a next one." Velsorin said, "How many ships will constitute overwhelming force against a species that becomes stronger under sustained threat, against a species whose social bonds strengthen under prolonged conflict, against a species whose entire history is a history of smaller, weaker things outlasting larger, stronger ones by simply refusing to stop?" Arn had an answer. Velsorin saw him forming it, but the answer required a number, and the number, when Arn calculated it internally, wasn't a number. He said it out loud. The council member who spoke was the oldest representative present, a Laurentian who had held this seat for 60 years and had seen 4 different first contact failures during his tenure, and none of them were like this one. He said, "Is there a path to negotiation?" Velsorin said, "The human response to the first diplomatic failure was to send one man with still hands and no weapons, with a request for a meeting. They are not a species that doesn't understand negotiations. They understand them very well. They also understand them as one of many tools. If we approach them from a position of continued aggression, they will continue to adapt and fight. If we approach from a position," he searched for the word, "of acknowledging mutual status, then yes, I believe they will negotiate. But I want to be clear about one thing. Any agreement we reach with humanity will not be because they need it. It will be because they choose it. There is a difference. We must not approach the table forgetting which side of this perimeter we are on." There was a long silence in the hall. Arn left without saying anything more. Velsorin gathered his materials. He walked out of the room. The corridor outside was cool and bright and smelled of nothing in particular. Mira-Et walked beside him. She said nothing for a long time. Then, "Do you think they will listen?" "Some of them," he said. "Is that enough?" She thought about the fleet numbers, the 7 doctrine changes in 30 days, the ships where there had been 40. "I think," he said carefully, "that whether they listen or not will matter much less than it did 60 days ago." She thought about this and nodded. They walked down the corridor together in silence, which was the only reasonable thing to do. The offer to negotiate was sent on the 47th day. It took the Quorum Council 3 days of arguing to agree on the wording. Not because they didn't agree on whether to offer it by the 44th day. Even the members who had approved the initial strike had stopped arguing about further escalation, but because no one in 400 years of Quorum diplomatic history had ever dealt with writing a message like this, every Quorum diplomatic offer had always been written from a position of strength. The language of Quorum diplomacy was built on that foundation. Even the most generous offers, even those made in sincere goodwill, had an architecture of power beneath them. A certain weight to the proposals, a certain direction of authority. The drafters kept writing that way, kept reviewing the draft and feeling that something was wrong, discarding it, and starting over. On the 5th attempt, an assistant who had been silent throughout the process suggested, carefully, that perhaps they were writing the wrong type of offer. "We keep writing as if we are offering them something," she said. "Perhaps we should write as if we are asking." The room considered it. The 5th draft was shorter than any previous Quorum diplomatic message. It stated in plain language that the conflict had not gone as expected, that the Quorum believed that a settlement through negotiation would be better for both sides than continuing the engagement, and that they were ready to discuss terms at any time and in any place chosen by humanity. It offered nothing. It asked. The message was sent. There followed 6 days of silence. This was different from the first silence. The first silence after the moon strike had lasted 22 hours of hidden, furious activity. The Quorum saw communication traffic, even if they couldn't decipher it. This silence was quieter. The traffic was there, but lower, calmer. On the Quorum station, the silence felt like waiting for a verdict. Velsorin used the 6 days to finish his full report, not the emergency submission that had been filed and presented. The full document that started from the beginning of human evolutionary history and followed the line to the present day. He was a thorough man. He always wrote thorough reports. But this one he wrote slowly, because writing it slowly meant he had to think about every part of the history separately. and thinking about each part separately meant he constantly arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. He was on page 43 when Mira entered his office without knocking, which she had never done before. She placed a tablet on his desk. He looked at it. It was a cultural analysis. She had been conducting it quietly for 2 weeks alongside his biological work, a parallel track that neither of them had discussed formally. He took it and read. She looked at human mythology. The stories they told about themselves, the most ancient stories that preceded recorded history, reconstructed through oral tradition, research, and comparative mythological studies that appeared in slightly different forms in every isolated human culture, on every continent. Every intelligent species the Quorum had catalogued had origin myths, stories about where they came from and what they were meant to be. Aritz told a story about emerging from darkness into light. Velkai had a creation myth centered on harmony, on how the universe found balance. Laurenti, the oldest founders of the Quorum, had a creation story about two forces becoming one. Every species had some version of paradise in the beginning, something whole and good that defined what they were meant to be before complications appeared. Mira studied the origin mythology of every major human culture. None of them began with paradise. Every one of them began with struggle, conflict, a trial that had to be survived. The earliest human heroes were not peaceful figures who maintained harmony. They were figures who endured, figures who fought, figures who went into the darkness and returned from it changed, carrying something hard-won. The human concept of a good life is not a life without difficulty. It is a life that has survived difficulty and was shaped by it. The human concept of a worthy person is not one who avoided the fire. It is one who walked through it. This was not a cultural value they developed. This was their most ancient story. The story they told before they had writing, before they had cities, before they had agriculture, before they had almost anything. They had already decided that the highest a human could be is one who faced something terrible and kept walking. Velsorin read the analysis twice. Then he put it down and stared at the wall for a long time. They didn't inherit it, said Mira. Mythology didn't create the value. The value created the mythology. You don't tell stories like that, he said, if they don't already match something in you. They dreamed of this before they had the neurology to dream of anything else. She didn't answer. The offer needed no answer. He turned to his report. He wrote one new line at the top, before the introduction, before the methodology, before everything else. He wrote, "We classified their war as a phase." He wrote, "We were wrong about what it was a phase of." Then he stopped and didn't write anything for a while. The answer came on the 6th day. It was brief. A location, a station at the edge of the solar system, neutral territory by any definition, a time, a list of 3 names of human representatives who would be present. The first name on the list was Commander Daniel Osei. Taras Vel read the list and thought about his still hands. She had often thought of them over the last 47 days, against the backdrop of everything else, the way you constantly return to an image your brain marked as significant before you understood why. Now she understood. She had seen many people under pressure. She had sat across from heads of state, military commanders, revolutionaries, people who had everything at stake. Under sufficient pressure, everyone moves. It wasn't a weakness. It was biology. It was the body expressing what the mind, being too disciplined, couldn't show. Osei's hands didn't move, not because he wasn't afraid. She suspected Commander Osei understood fear very well, but because somewhere in the architecture of his device, the fear didn't reach his hands. It went somewhere else. It went into that quiet, full attention he gave to her every word. It went into how his eyes moved not fast, not nervously, but with the specific care of an assessment. The way, she believed, a hunter assesses a situation. She didn't know what she had seen then. She was the Quorum's best diplomat. She was going to the meeting. She had requested to lead it herself. The meeting lasted 9 hours. Velsorin wasn't there. He received the summary the next morning, a 20-page document that he read in 2 hours, and then read again. The terms were not what he expected. He had prepared for punitive demands. He had prepared for territorial claims, for reparations, for the terms a losing side accepts because it has no other choice. He had seen other negotiations that followed military conflicts. The terms of the winners always reflected the gap in power. Always it was an almost mathematical relationship. Osei's terms did not. The Quorum retained full sovereignty. Territories were not transferred. Reparations for the strike on the moon, which was objectively an act of aggression against a species that hadn't yet attacked them, were not required. The Quorum would contribute resources to rebuild the human ships lost in the conflict. A concession, but a modest one, formulated as a gesture of goodwill rather than an obligation. In return, humanity received a permanent seat on the Quorum Council, equal status with the founding species, full access to Quorum technology, trade networks, and diplomatic systems. And one additional condition, clearly stated in plain language in the document: any act of aggression against humanity by any member of the Quorum or an allied organization will be treated as an act of aggression against the Quorum itself. Protection is guaranteed. Velsorin read that line 3 times. On the 3rd time, he understood. They weren't angry. That was what he had expected, that humans would be angry. He had expected them to bring to these negotiations the weight of a species that had been struck without warning, that had lost ships and people, that had spent 47 days fighting something that significantly exceeded it in size. He had expected that weight to manifest as demands, anger, the specific rage that a small thing shows when it has proven it can survive against a big one. They weren't angry. They were finished, and they knew the difference. Anger would say, "You will pay for this." Instead, they said, "This will not happen again." Not punishment, but a perimeter, a wall they were drawing around themselves and calling the price of crossing it. Velsorin thought about this for a long time. Then he returned to his report. He finished it 4 days later. The final section was the hardest to write. Not because the data was unclear, the data had been clear for weeks, but because stating it in plain language required saying something for which the scientific and diplomatic system of the Quorum had no category. He wrote it anyway. He wrote about the archaeological record, about the tools that appeared before everything else. He wrote about mythology, using Mira Et's analysis, carefully citing her work. He wrote about biology, psychology, stress response, and social cohesion. All of it. All the parts collected in order. And then, at the end, he wrote the conclusion. We approach this species with a framework built on one assumption: that intelligence strives for peace, that with sufficient development, sufficient stability, sufficient time, the violent phase of a civilization's growth gives way to something calmer, something more suitable for long-term coexistence. This framework is true for every species we have encountered. It is not true for humanity, not because humanity is incapable of coexistence. The record of the negotiations demonstrates that it is not only capable but will choose it when approached with honesty and genuine respect. The error was in the premise. We assumed that for humanity, as for all other species we know, the driving force is peace, and the capacity for war is a layer over it, a phase, a remnant, something that the deep self grows away from. The evidence suggests the opposite. The peace is sincere. The creativity is sincere. The art, music, love, and community. All of it is sincere. But underneath it all, older than all of it, deeper than all of it, is something that was formed by 2 million years of being smaller, slower, and weaker than everything that wanted to kill it. Something that learned in that time that the only answer to something that wants to kill you is endurance. We are not dealing with a civilization that hasn't yet grown out of its war. We are dealing with a civilization that grew in everything else while keeping its war. Like a tree that grows around a stone. The stone is still there. It will always be there. The appropriate response is not fear. The appropriate response is to remember which side of the perimeter you are on. He saved the document, sent it, and marked it for full distribution to the council. Then he turned off his screen. On Earth, a few weeks after the treaty was signed, a child was playing in the yard of a house in a city that had spent 47 days preparing for a war that looked nothing like any war it had prepared for. The child was small, about 7, playing the way children play without an audience, without a goal, just using the world in front of them as material. She picked up a stick. She pointed it at something in the yard, maybe a bird, a shadow, something that moved. She made a sound with her mouth, the sound of an explosion. A specific sound children made in every culture, on every continent, throughout the entire human historical record as old as childhood itself. She laughed. The stick dropped. She ran across the yard after something completely different, already finished with the game, already somewhere new. A Quorum observation drone recorded the moment. It was a passive drone, routine coverage of the kind maintained in populated areas across all Quorum-controlled worlds. The footage automatically went into the general archive. No one flagged it for review. It lay in the archive along with 10,000 other ordinary shots from that day, unflagged, unremarkable. In his office, Velsarin was already working on his next file. A new species, a water world, 3 stars. Distant preliminary surveys suggested they were peaceful, slow, extremely sociable. No evidence of organized conflict in their entire recorded history. He started to read. He didn't know at that moment that Mira-Et had seen the drone footage, that she had opened it while browsing the daily archive, and had watched it twice. That she had sat with it for a long time. That she had written one line in her personal notes, and then closed the file and never opened it again. The line read, "They played at it before they understood what it was for." She didn't send it. Some things you understand, and understanding them is enough, and saying them out loud only makes the room colder. She went home. The station spun in space. And somewhere in the direction of the yellow star, on a planet that for the last 2 months had been building faster than anyone could have imagined, a species that was smaller, slower, and weaker than everything that had wanted to kill it for 2 million years, looked at the stars and smiled and returned to work.